July 30th, 1945, 14 hours, the Philippine Sea, roughly halfway between Guam and Leyte Gulf. Captain Charles McVay III stood on the bridge of the USS Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser that had, 11 days earlier, completed one of the most secret missions of the entire war, carrying components of the atomic bomb that would fall on Hiroshima to the island of Tinian, then sailing on toward the Philippines to join the invasion fleet being assembled for Okinawa and the expected assault on Japan itself. He had asked for a destroyer escort. Command had told him none were available and that the route was safe. At 14, a Japanese submarine, I-58, fired 6 torpedoes. 2 struck the Indianapolis. The first tore away the bow. The second detonated near a fuel tank and a powder magazine, and the resulting explosion split the ship nearly in 2. She sank in 12 minutes, so fast that most of her 51 radio room personnel never got a distress call fully composed, let alone confirmed as received. Around 900 of her crew of nearly 1,200 went into the water alive. They had no idea that the nearest help was hundreds of miles away, and even less idea of something far stranger, that under the Navy's own reporting procedures, no one on land was specifically watching for the Indianapolis to arrive anywhere at all. For the next 4 days and 5 nights, in shark-infested, oil-slicked water under a merciless tropical sun, the survivors of the Indianapolis would wait for a rescue that no one had been assigned to send, because as far as any command post on land could tell, there was nothing yet to notice was missing. To understand how the U.S. Navy, at the height of its wartime efficiency, could lose a warship and its entire crew for 4 days without anyone raising an alarm, we need to go back to the routing office in Guam, 10 days before the Indianapolis ever left port, and to a set of small, reasonable-sounding decisions that quietly built a hole in the system large enough to swallow 1,200 men. The Indianapolis's mission to Tinian was classified at a level few ships in the Pacific Fleet ever operated under. She sailed under sealed orders, moved at flank speed, and made port at Tinian without her own crew fully understanding what they had just delivered. That secrecy, essential for the mission itself, became the first thread in the failure that followed. Standard Navy practice for combatant ships in the Pacific in mid-1945 did not require that arrival be specifically tracked and confirmed the way it would for, say, a returning convoy of merchant vessels. A warship's movement orders were themselves considered classified information, and the assumption baked into Navy routing procedure was straightforward. If a combatant ship failed to arrive somewhere, someone along the way would notice and report it. That assumption had never really been tested at scale before, because for most of the war, most ship movements happened within escorted task forces, convoys, or heavily trafficked routes, where a missing ship was conspicuous within hours. The Indianapolis was sailing the final leg of her journey alone, unescorted, on a route the Navy itself had already logged as containing recent enemy submarine activity. Intelligence that existed in Guam's files but was never passed to McVay before he sailed. Command at Guam had denied McVay's request for a destroyer escort with the explanation that the route was safe, and no escorts were available for a ship of the Indianapolis's classification, since heavy cruisers were not usually considered to need escort against submarine threat, despite the fact that this exact stretch of ocean had seen a Japanese submarine sink another U.S. ship, the destroyer escort Underhill, only weeks earlier. A fact recorded in the same headquarters that told McVay the water ahead was clear. If you've had family who served aboard cruisers or destroyers in the Pacific and want their story told, tell me about them in the comments. Most of what happened to these ships never made it into the popular history of the war. Once the Indianapolis was struck and sank, the failure compounded through at least 3 separate points in the Navy's own bureaucracy, none of which individually looked like negligence at the time, and all of which together produced 4 days of silence. First, the distress signals themselves. Radio men aboard the sinking Indianapolis did manage to transmit at least one, and by some survivor accounts as many as 3, SOS messages before the ship went down. Post-war investigation established that at least 3 shore stations may have received some version of these signals. One communications watch officer reportedly believed the signal was a Japanese deception intended to lure a rescue ship into a trap, a real and previously used enemy tactic in the Pacific, which made the skepticism understandable even as it proved catastrophic. Another watch officer's superior had, by several post-war accounts, been drinking and left standing orders not to be disturbed. A third station apparently logged the signal but took no further action, assuming another station would handle follow-up. 3 separate points of possible action, 3 separate assumptions that someone else was covering it. Second, the arrival tracking gap. Because the Indianapolis was a Philippine sea battle-tested heavy combatant rather than a convoy or merchant vessel, the movement report system in place at the time did not require the destination port to actively confirm her arrival and report an alarm if she failed to show. Leyte Gulf, her destination, simply did not flag her non-arrival on July 31st as an emergency, because under the procedures then in force, the non-arrival of a combatant ship was not, by itself, treated as evidence of anything having gone wrong. Ships were often delayed, rerouted, or given new orders without every downstream station being immediately informed. Third, once she failed to arrive, no single office had clear ownership of noticing. This is the detail that would draw the most scrutiny after the fact. The port director's office at Leyte and the operations staff at Guam each later stated, in essence, that they believed the other was responsible for flagging the missing ship. It was not any one person's assigned job to ask, on the morning of July 31st, where is the Indianapolis? And so, for reasons that made a kind of narrow bureaucratic sense at every individual link in the chain, nobody asked. 900 men were now in the water, and not one office on land yet knew to look for them. What followed for the survivors has become one of the most harrowing ordeals documented from the entire Pacific War. The men who survived the initial sinking were scattered across miles of open ocean, many without life rafts, wearing Kapok life jackets that gradually became waterlogged and lost buoyancy over the following days. Fuel oil coated the water and the men themselves, causing severe chemical burns to eyes, skin, and throats for those who swallowed it. The tropical sun during daylight hours caused severe dehydration, sunburn, and eventually delirium in men who had gone days without fresh water. And then came the sharks. Oceanic whitetip sharks, drawn by blood, vibration, and the sheer scale of men in the water, began circling and attacking within the first full day and continued for the duration. Survivor accounts describe watching men disappear beneath the surface in 2s and 3s as the days wore on, the attacks becoming more frequent as exhausted men drifted apart from the shrinking clusters that had initially formed for safety. It remains, to this day, widely cited as the deadliest single shark attack incident in recorded history, though exact numbers of deaths directly attributable to shark attacks versus exposure, dehydration, and saltwater poisoning are difficult to separate with precision even in post-war analysis. By the second and third days, severe hallucinations had set in among many survivors. Men convinced they saw a friendly ship, or fresh water, or dry land, sometimes leading groups to swim toward imagined rescue and drown from exhaustion, or to attack fellow survivors under the delusion that they were enemies. Petty officers and remaining officers, themselves in the same physical state, worked to hold groups together, ration what little fresh water some rafts carried, and physically restrain men in the grip of saltwater psychosis. This next part of the story is hard to sit with. If the details of what these men went through feel like too much right now, That's a completely reasonable place to pause. The rescue is coming. The Indianapolis was finally discovered not because anyone was searching for her, but by chance. On the morning of August 2nd, more than 3.5 days after the sinking, a PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber piloted by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol when his crew spotted what appeared to be a long oil slick in the water below. Investigating, they saw men in the water. Gwynn immediately radioed a report and dropped a life raft and a radio transmitter. The response, once triggered, moved with the speed the entire preceding 4 days had lacked. A PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks was dispatched, and on arriving at the scene and finding men being picked off by sharks in the open water, made the unauthorized decision to land his aircraft directly on the open ocean, a maneuver against standing orders due to the risk of the aircraft breaking apart on the swells, in order to begin pulling survivors aboard immediately rather than wait for surface ships. Marks and his crew pulled roughly 56 men from the water directly into and onto the wings of the aircraft before it became so overloaded that further landings became too dangerous to attempt. Surface ships, redirected at flank speed once the report reached Fleet Command, began arriving through the night and into the following day. The destroyer escort USS Cecil Doyle arrived that evening and, on her own initiative, illuminated her searchlight vertically into the night sky against standard blackout procedure in a combat zone, specifically so that any remaining survivors in the darkness could see there was help nearby. Of the roughly 900 men who had gone into the water alive after the sinking, only 316 were pulled out alive 4 days later. It remains the largest single loss of life from one ship in the history of the United States Navy. In the aftermath, the Navy needed an explanation, and the explanation it produced would haunt one man for the rest of his life. Captain Charles McVay III was court-martialed, the only commanding officer in U.S. naval history to be court-martialed for the loss of a ship to enemy action during wartime, on the charge of failing to zigzag his ship as an anti-submarine evasive maneuver in the moments before the attack. The prosecution's own key witness, remarkably, was the commander of the Japanese submarine that had sunk the Indianapolis, Machitsura Hashimoto, brought to testify that zigzagging would have made no difference at the range and conditions of his attack, testimony that did not prevent McVay's conviction. McVay was formally reprimanded and effectively saw his naval career ended, despite the court-martial's own evidence pointing toward the string of failures described above. The denied escort request, the withheld intelligence about recent submarine activity on his route, the ignored or misinterpreted distress signals, and the arrival tracking gap that meant no one was even looking for his ship for 3.5 days. Families of some of the lost crew sent him hate mail for the rest of his life, holding him personally responsible for their sons' deaths. In 1968, Charles McVay took his own life. It would take more than 3 decades, a dedicated campaign by surviving crew members, and the research of a middle school student named Hunter Scott, whose History Fair project drew renewed public and congressional attention to the case in the late 1990s, before the U.S. Congress passed a resolution in 2000, and the Navy formally amended his record in 2001, exonerating McVay of responsibility for the loss of his ship. The deeper verdict of the Indianapolis tragedy is not about one captain's evasive maneuvers. It is about what happens when a bureaucracy built for wartime efficiency creates gaps at the exact seams between departments, gaps where secrecy, understaffing, assumption, and a lack of clear ownership can each look individually reasonable and collectively cost hundreds of lives before anyone is forced to ask the one simple question that should have been asked on the morning of July 31st. Where is the Indianapolis? The wreck of the USS Indianapolis was finally located in 2017, more than 18,000 feet down in the Philippine Sea, found not by the Navy, but by a privately funded expedition backed by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, using archival research that had, ironically, been sitting unexamined in the Navy's own records for 72 years. Today, her wreck lies undisturbed on the seafloor as a war grave. The men who survived those 4 days in the water largely carried the experience quietly for the rest of their lives, gathering for reunions each July, their numbers dwindling with each passing year, until the last known survivor passed away in 2024. What they left behind was not just an account of extraordinary human endurance, but a stark demonstration of how a system built by careful, competent people can still fail completely. Not through any single villain's negligence, but through the silent agreement of several reasonable people that surely, somewhere else in the chain, someone else was watching.